Elena Marsh was 24 years old, and she had learned a long time ago never to ask why. Why her mother locked the pantry each night. Why the bruises always seemed to bloom on the days she dared to smile too much, laugh too loud, look too happy. Why she still asked permission to leave her own house. She had stopped asking. She had only learned how to survive the answer. Diane Marsh was a woman the whole town adored. Sweet at church, generous at the market. The kind of mother remembered fondly by old teachers, trusted without question by every neighbor who had never once seen what happened behind her closed front door. Behind that door, Diane rationed the food, monitored every message on Elena's phone, and delivered cruelty in small, careful doses. Never enough to leave a mark anyone else would notice. Always enough to keep her daughter small. Elena had no friends left. Diane had made sure of that years ago, wearing down every friendship until the effort of keeping one alive became too exhausting for anyone but her. She kept a $20 bill hidden in the lining of her coat. She kept a journal she only opened when she was certain the door was locked. Small private proof that some part of her hadn't yet gone out. Mornings began the same way. Diane would already be at the kitchen table, coffee poured, expression pleasant enough that a stranger walking in might think nothing was wrong at all. But Elena had learned to read the weather in her mother's face the way sailors read the sky, the tight set of her mouth, the particular way she'd say Elena's name, elongating it just slightly, like a warning wrapped in affection. On good days, Elena moved through the house like a ghost, quiet, agreeable, careful not to give her mother any reason to notice her. On bad days, nothing she did mattered anyway. She worked at the pharmacy in town, one of the only jobs Diane allowed, mostly because it kept Elena visible and accounted for during daylight hours. She handed out prescriptions and made small talk with the same customers week after week. People who had known her since she was a child, and who all seemed to share the same quiet, unspoken belief. That Diane Marsh was simply devoted, and Elena was simply shy. Nobody asked why she never came to the diner after work with the other girls her age. Nobody asked why she flinched at raised voices, even friendly ones, even laughter that came too suddenly. They had all, in their own way, stopped looking closely enough to see. The evening everything changed began like any other. Elena came home 12 minutes later than her mother expected, delayed by a customer who needed extra help at the counter, and found Diane already waiting by the door, arms crossed, her voice dropping into that low, controlled register that Elena had learned meant the night ahead would be a bad one. There was no shouting. Diane didn't need to shout. She simply informed Elena that she'd be driving up to the Hendricks place at the top of the mountain pass to collect a box of canning supplies Diane had ordered weeks ago and never bothered to pick up. Never mind that a storm warning had been on the local news all afternoon. Never mind that the roads were already slick with the first snow of the season. Elena knew, the way she always knew, that this wasn't really about canning supplies. It was about the 12 minutes. It was punishment dressed up as an errand, the way so many of her mother's cruelties came dressed as something reasonable. She didn't argue. Arguing had never once worked in her favor. She took the car keys from the hook by the door and drove out into a sky already going the color of a bruise. Snow falling harder with every mile she climbed. The heater in her old sedan had never worked quite right, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as the road narrowed and the visibility dropped to almost nothing ahead of her headlights. She told herself a lot of things, most nights, to make the fear more bearable. The car began to shudder somewhere past the second switchback, the engine coughing, losing power in stages, until it finally gave out completely on a stretch of road with no houses, no lights at all. Nothing but pine trees bending under the weight of the storm. Elena turned the key again and again, but the engine only clicked, useless, and the heater died with it, leaving the cold to creep into the car through every seam in the door. She sat there for a long time, watching her breath fog the windshield, feeling the temperature fall degree by degree. She thought about walking, but she had no idea how far the nearest house might be, and the snow outside had already erased the road's edges into a single unbroken white. She thought about her mother, waiting at home, and wondered distantly whether Diane would even notice how long she'd been gone, or whether she'd simply assume Elena was being difficult again. She thought, in the strange, quiet way exhaustion sometimes allows a person to think dangerous thoughts calmly, that this might be easier than going home. That was when she saw the light. It moved through the snow steadily, unhurried, a lantern swinging low to the ground, the way a person carries one when they know a mountain road well enough not to need to look at their own feet. Elena watched it come closer, too cold and too tired to feel the fear she probably should have felt at a stranger approaching her car in the dark. The door opened. A man crouched down into the storm's freezing wind, dressed in a heavy canvas coat, face weathered by years spent outdoors, and looked at her with an expression that held no threat in it at all, only a kind of quiet, practical concern. The look of someone assessing a problem so he could solve it. "You're not going to make it another mile in this," he said, his voice low and steady beneath the wind. "Cabin's not far, come on." Elena would learn his name was Caleb Reyes only after he'd already carried her half the way there, her body too stiff with cold to walk on her own, his arms steady beneath her weight as though she weighed nothing at all. She would learn, in the days that followed, that he'd left the army years earlier, after losing a soldier under his care he couldn't save, and that he'd built himself a solitary life on this ridge, specifically so that he'd never again be responsible for a life he couldn't protect. She would learn all of this slowly, in pieces, over firelight and long silences. But that first night, she knew only this: a stranger had come out into a storm for her, without being asked, without any explanation required of her at all. And when he set her down by the hearth of his small cabin, and wrapped a heavy blanket around her shoulders, Elena Marsh, who had spent her whole life waiting for the cost of any kindness to reveal itself, found herself waiting once again. This time, as the fire caught and the warmth slowly returned to her fingers, the cost never came. The days that followed moved slowly, the way days do when the world outside has gone white and silent, and there's nothing to do but wait for it to pass. Caleb tended to Elena's hands each morning and evening, wrapping the places where frostbite had bitten into her fingers, working with the same careful, unhurried precision he brought to everything else. He said very little as he did it. Elena, for her part, watched him the way a person watches for the moment a trap finally springs shut, because in her experience, kindness always came with a price eventually. She just hadn't been told yet what this one would cost her. She apologized constantly in those first days. She apologized for the food she ate, for the space she took up on his couch, for waking him in the night when the cold made her shiver hard enough to rattle the old cabin's floorboards. Each time, Caleb would simply look at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and tell her there was nothing to be sorry for. He never explained why he understood this reflex in her so easily. He simply kept absorbing it, patiently, refusing to let it change how he treated her. It was nearly a week before Elena told him anything true about her life. It came out sideways, almost by accident, when she mentioned in passing that she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal without calculating whether she'd be allowed a second one. Caleb had gone very still at that, his hands pausing over the fire he was building, and when he looked at her, there was no pity in his expression, only a kind of recognition, as though a puzzle piece he'd been holding for days had finally clicked into place. "Your mother," he said. It wasn't a question. Elena didn't answer at first. She had spent so many years protecting the secret of her own home that the idea of simply saying it out loud, to someone who might actually believe her, felt almost physically impossible. But something about the quiet of the cabin, the absence of any pressure to explain herself quickly or perform her pain convincingly, loosened something in her chest that had been clenched shut for years. She told him about the locked pantry, about counting the hours between meals, about bruises explained away to neighbors as clumsiness, about a childhood spent learning exactly how much space she was allowed to take up in her own home before the air around her mother turned cold and dangerous. Caleb listened without interrupting, without flinching, without once making her feel as though she was asking for too much, simply by telling the truth. When she finally finished, he told her, quietly, about the soldier he'd lost, a young private who'd bled out under his hands in a field hospital, despite every single thing Caleb had done right. He told her he'd left the service not long after, convinced that distance was the only way to keep himself from ever failing someone that badly again. He told her he recognized the flinching in her, the reflexive apologies, the careful way she made herself smaller in a room, because he'd seen those same patterns in soldiers who'd learned to survive far worse before they ever saw combat. Fear, he told her, was rarely born in a person. It was almost always taught. Something between them shifted after that night. Elena stopped apologizing quite so often. She began asking questions of her own, about the trap lines he checked each morning, about the woodworking scattered across his workbench, about the life he'd built for himself so far from anyone else. And Caleb, a man who had spoken to almost no one by choice for years, found himself answering. It was nearly 2 weeks before Diane discovered her daughter hadn't simply gotten stranded and found her own way home eventually, the way she'd assumed at first, annoyed more than worried. When the silence stretched long enough to threaten her control, rather than simply her convenience, her fury sharpened into something calculated. She didn't call the sheriff out of concern for her daughter's safety. She called with a story already built and polished. A dangerous stranger in the woods, a missing girl, a mother's desperate search, because she understood, better than anyone, exactly how believable she sounded to people who'd never once doubted her. The deputy who took her call had known Diane for 15 years. He'd eaten her casseroles at church potlucks. He believed every word she told him without hesitation, and he agreed to drive her up the mountain himself to bring her daughter home. Elena heard the truck's engine before she saw it, and something cold settled low in her stomach, an old familiar fear resurfacing, despite the 2 weeks of safety she'd only just begun to trust. Caleb, watching her face change, stepped between her and the door before either of them had said a word. "Whatever happens," he told her quietly, "you don't have to go anywhere you don't choose to go." Elena wanted, badly, to believe him, but 2 weeks of kindness was a thin shield against 24 years of learning exactly how little her own wishes had ever mattered. The truck pulled up outside the cabin, and Diane stepped out into the snow, already weeping, already performing the particular brief she'd perfected over a lifetime of being believed. She looked past Caleb entirely, straight at Elena standing in the doorway, and for one terrible moment, Elena felt every ounce of the ground she'd found beneath her feet these past 2 weeks begin, quietly, to give way. "There you are," Diane said, her voice breaking with practiced precision, loud enough for the deputy standing beside her to hear every syllable. "Do you have any idea what you put me through? I thought you were dead. I thought this man had—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The accusation hung in the cold air between them, aimed squarely at Caleb, who stood perfectly still on his own porch, his expression giving away nothing at all. The deputy, a heavy-set man named Wallace, who'd known Diane since before Elena was born, shifted his weight and looked between the three of them with the particular discomfort of a man who'd expected a simple rescue and found something far more complicated waiting for him instead. "Elena," he said carefully, "your mother's been worried sick. Storm like that, car stranded up here. We need to get you checked out, get you home safe." For a moment, standing in the doorway with the cold biting at her ankles and her mother's tears glistening with practiced conviction in the porch light, Elena felt the old pull take hold of her. The years of conditioning that told her the safest thing, the only thing, was to apologize, to comply, to fold herself back into whatever shape her mother needed her to be. Her mouth opened to say the words she'd said 1,000 times before. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to worry you. I'll come home now." But something in her throat refused to form them. She thought of the 2 weeks behind her, of being fed without having to earn it, of being asked what she wanted rather than told what she deserved, of a man who'd carried her out of a snowstorm and never once made her feel like she owed him anything for it. She thought of the flinch Caleb had recognized in her without needing to be told its source. The way he'd named it so gently, it hadn't felt like an accusation at all. Only the truth finally being spoken by someone other than herself. "I'm not going home," Elena said. Her voice shook, but it held. Diane's tears paused, just for a moment, something colder flickering behind her eyes, before the performance resumed. "Sweetheart, you're confused. You've been through something traumatic. You don't know what you're. I know exactly what I'm saying." Elena stepped fully out onto the porch now, the cold air sharp in her lungs, but she didn't stop. She looked at Deputy Wallace, a man who'd known her whole life, and had never once asked why she seemed to shrink a little smaller every year. "She locks the pantry at night. She's done it since I was 16. She reads every message on my phone. When I come home even a few minutes late, she doesn't let me eat dinner. And if I argue, it gets worse than that. Ask her about the winter I broke my wrist. Ask her what she told the hospital happened." The porch went silent, except for the wind moving through the pines. Deputy Wallace's easy, practiced expression faltered, some old, uneasy memory visibly surfacing behind his eyes. A hospital visit years back, an explanation that hadn't quite added up at the time, quickly forgotten because no one had wanted to look closer. Diane's mask cracked at the edges. "This is absurd," she snapped, and for the first time that night, her voice lost its careful, grief-stricken performance and turned sharp, cold, unmistakably familiar to Elena in a way that confirmed every word she'd just spoken. "You ungrateful—" She caught herself. Too late. Wallace had heard it, the sudden shift, the same cruelty Elena had just described, made visible in real time. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Caleb, still standing quietly beside Elena, said the only thing that needed saying. "She's coming with me." It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't possession. It was simply a fact, offered plainly, backing up a decision that had already been made by the only person whose decision it was to make. Deputy Wallace looked at Elena for a long moment, and whatever he saw on her face, steady now, despite the shaking in her hands, seemed to settle something in him. He told Diane, gently but firmly, that he couldn't force an adult woman to go anywhere she didn't choose to go, and that given what he'd just heard, he'd be following up with some questions of his own in the coming days. Diane's protests followed them as Wallace walked her back to the truck, her voice rising, now that the performance no longer served her, but Elena didn't flinch at it the way she once would have. She simply watched the truck's taillights disappear back down the mountain road, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched shut for as long as she could remember. The weeks that followed were not simple. Elena filed a protective order, and found herself more than once sitting across from officials repeating details of her own life that she'd spent years learning to hide. But each time she spoke, it grew a little easier, the truth wearing smoother the more she used it. The town, slowly and unevenly, began to see Diane differently too, not through any single dramatic reckoning, but through the quiet accumulation of neighbors remembering small, uneasy details they'd once dismissed, now impossible to unsee. Caleb never asked Elena to stay in his cabin permanently, never tried to become the next person she organized her entire life around. Instead, he helped her find a small room to rent in town, close enough to the mountain that she could visit whenever she wanted, far enough that the life she built there would be entirely her own. She got her old job back at the pharmacy, and this time, when the other girls invited her to the diner after closing, she went. Months later, when the first snow of the new winter began falling outside her window, Elena didn't feel the old dread rise in her chest the way it always had before. She thought of a stalled car on a mountain road, and a lantern moving steadily through the storm, and a voice that had asked for nothing in return for its kindness. She thought of 3 words spoken plainly on a porch, not as a rescue, but as proof that someone finally stood beside her instead of over her. She had spent her whole life waiting for someone to save her. What she hadn't expected was that the saving would only be the beginning, that the real work would be everything that came after. The quiet, daily choice to keep believing she deserved a life of her own.